Chapter 15, Part 2. The alien peered over the edge of the cliff where Schaefer had fallen. It hesitated only a moment to lay aside the relics of the holy man. Then it dived over the edge as if it still harboured within it the glory of the hawk. It tore through the thick canopies of branches, agile and quick, bounding from limb to limb, soaring across 20 yards of space till it reached the lower hanging branches of a sycamore next to the river. It scanned the near jungle with its heat vision, seeking the telling yellow-red patterns that always revealed the frail form of man. But no man was there. Schaefer was well downstream now, caught in a swirl of white water a mile from where the alien poised itself. As the Major struggled towards the shore, he was helpless as a baby, totally at the mercy of cross currents and rapids, which pulled him farther and farther till he was finally sucked into an undertow and hurled over a 30-foot fall, plummeting down and driven deep underwater by the thundering force of the river. Seconds later, in the wide pool at the base of the falls, the deafening explosion of currents was behind him. Schaefer rolled at the bottom of the pool, his mind spinning in confusion, unaware of where he was or how to reach air. By the last stroke of his luck, the opposing currents gently propelled him to the surface, just in time to take a feeble breath. He was nearly finished, his energy sapped. But the surface water was sweet and reviving, and a few strokes with his good arm brought him into the shallows, where he was at last able to grip his toes in the muddy riverbed. As he tried to stand, he pitched forward headlong onto the grey muck by the riverbed. Then, with a final heave that drained the last shred of force he could muster, he crawled gasping and panting onto a sheltered mud overhang, settling into the tentacled root system of a dead tree, his body completely covered in thick grey sludge. He was fully primeval now, like the deepest beasts of the forest. Nearly unconscious, but still alert to his enemy, he raised his head and looked through glazed eyes to the opposite side of the river, scanning the bank. Seeing no sign of the alien, he collapsed in relief, his eyes rolling up into his head as the waves of fatigue and pain took over. His final, delirious thought was that he'd escaped, though just now in his battered state it was an escape that seemed strangely like death. But the moment the Major relaxed and was about to slip into unconsciousness, he heard a shattering splash in the pool below the falls. The alien had leaped from the branches of an overhanging tree and landed on Schaefer's side of the river, throwing up a muddy wave that washed onto the Major's feet. But even the reserve adrenaline was gone now. Dutch couldn't move a muscle as he saw the huge creature stand, water shimmering on its glowing body, the skin tone and texture swirling grey and brown and green in an attempt to match the surrounding river foliage. The glaring yellow orb stared directly at the spot where Schaefer lay, helplessly trapped in the tangle of roots. As the predator surged forward, standing tall in the shallows of the river, the Major's last conscious thought was that he'd lost. All he could do was stare in horror and fear, paralyzed with shock and fatigue as the monster closed in on him. He waited for the sting of death, too exhausted to fight, defenseless and alone. The alien rippled slowly through the water until only a few feet remained between them. Then it stopped, towering above him, as if to inspect its prey for one last full moment before the annihilation. Images of Hawkins, Blaine's, and Davis's mangled bodies collided in Schaefer's mind as he lay there motionless, helpless. He closed his eyes to wait for the final blow, his dignity intact. Seconds dragged by. Nothing. Schaefer dared to open one muddy eye and saw the alien still standing as before, impatiently turning its head from left to right. It looked up and down the riverbank, back and forth among the tree roots, yet acted as if it didn't see him. It didn't. It was trying to tune into Schaefer's heat source, but its optic scanning system couldn't penetrate the thick paste of cold mud that coated him. After a moment, the creature uttered a skirl of irritation and bewilderment, and turned aside. It moved heavily downstream from the battered Schaefer, searching the jungle clutches for its prey. The Major now opened his other eye, as if to double-check what he saw with the first. He was speechless with disbelief, Staggered that he was still alive, he watched the creature wander away, its prehensile spurs making a sucking sound in the mud. Then it rounded a bend and disappeared. Astonished and confused, Schaefer tried to raise up on his elbows, but a sudden jab of pain in his shoulder caused him to collapse again. He fell on his side and slipped into a troubled semi-coma, shivering now in the chill mud. A minute later, the slapping of helicopter blades grew louder over the top of the ridge. Then the steel bird flared into Schaefer's view as it followed the course of the river down the canyon. It maintained a holding pattern as a US soldier leaned out the open side, scanning the riverbank with binoculars. Seeing no signs of life, the chopper moved on, disappearing up the opposite rim of the canyon. Anna ran frantically through the jungle, her hair and clothes catching on brambles that ripped the coarse green cotton fatigues and bloodied her face. Her heart beat like a rabbit's from sheer exhaustion and panic as she gulped in great quantities of thick jungle air. She didn't have a breath left over to scream, and screaming was all that made any sense anymore. Her imagination was a kaleidoscope of blazing yellow eyes, and she felt the creature chasing her, reaching out a long three-fingered hand to grip her neck. But she kept on running, as if something far, far back had taught her to fight for even an hour more of life. During the course of Schaefer's quaking paralysis, he had a momentary nightmare in which the alien lanced him with its spearhead. The bleary-eyed, mud-choked commando awoke abruptly, and with a groan grappled up out of the swampy bed like some kind of being returned from the grave. He was hovering at the edge of delirium now, and his mind hammered with fantasies of the alien gorging his heart out. Then, still in an incoherent stupor, he swayed on his naked and bruised feet, and began to stumble along the riverbank, slogging through mud like quicksand. His shoulder flared with pain, and his temperature boiled at 103 from the deep wound, the stress and the chill of the mud. He lost his balance as he passed a clear, shallow pool, staggering backwards, suddenly finding himself waist-deep in the cool water. The soothing quiet shook him back to his senses, and his vision cleared. He stopped for a second to gather his wits. Then he waded over to the spongy, moss-covered bank of the pool and sat down heavily, breathing slowly as if to recover his center of gravity. The ripples he'd made on the water's surface as he pushed towards the shore flattened now, and he rested in the shallows. When the water calmed, he noticed his shimmering reflection growing sharper and sharper, the waves of distortion gradually cohering into a true mirror image of his face and torso. His hair was matted flat, with a thick coating of grey mud, and his face and chest were streaked with the pasty slate-coloured sludge. He stared, mesmerised at his wild reflection. All the props of a soldier were gone. Slowly, as if in a dream, he lifted his arm from the water, and with his fingertips wiped clean a patch of skin along his cheek. He studied the stickly, pungent mud on his hand, then looked back at his face in the water, and saw the vivid contrast between the muddy camouflage and the lightly tanned skin beneath. As he stared, a wave of realization rushed over him so powerfully it dizzied him for a second. "My God!" he breathed aloud, his eyes widening with recognition. "You couldn't see me!" Awestruck, he addressed the absent alien, each syllable crisp and precise, as if the insight were being engraved forever in his mind. Now he understood that the creature saw differently than the animals of Earth. Maybe this could be its Achilles heel. He chuckled, almost hysterically, a combination of relief, exhausted tension, and the renewal of courage. Schaefer gazed up into the failing light, at the tree line of the darkening forest, realizing fate had given him a second chance, an unexpected new weapon, his own chameleon challenge. The recognition of a possible defense stirred the commando in him. Vigorously, he slapped up a handful of mud and carefully repainted the patches of skin he had earlier wiped clean. "You couldn't see me," the major repeated with grinning delight, whispering the words this time as he stroked the side of his face with clay. His soldiering instincts quickened to life, The Major's mind flared up like a stoked furnace, burning with the ideas for final combat. The only weapon he still had left was his machete. His clothes, his shoes, everything had been lost to the rapids and falls. Naked now, as the most primitive savage, he was stripped down to his instincts and wits, and decided there was a certain irony to it all. He'd have to draw from the jungle now, to build an arsenal with which to fight the creature. But the primitive twist didn't really disturb him, because all the high-tech fancy equipment the commandos had used thus far hadn't so much as made the creature flinch. The newly charged warrior clambered out of the trench beside the pool, Olympian in size and with his coat of mud as ancient as a caveman. Immediately, he set to work making a bow. First, he carved magnesium shavings from a volcanic rock and swept them into a pile of kindling, removing a dry match from the hollow handle of his knife, which also contained a coil of piano wire, a roll of green tape, and a couple of cyanide capsules. He lighted the shavings and watched them burn to a brilliant, ice-white glow. Then he ripped a banana leaf from a nearby tree and sheltered the fire till the flame burned down in order to shield it from the alien's sensors. Gradually, he fed the fire more kindling, fanning it rhythmically with the leaf. 20 minutes later, he was twirling a 7-foot section of fire-hardened sapling between his feet and his good shoulder, scraping the char from the seasoned wood with his knife. Then he bent the bow and attached a long strand of piano wire to one end, carefully winding it for strength, using strips of green tape to cover the wire where the nook of the arrow would fit. With fishing line, he attached split parrot feathers to an arrow he'd whittled from a branch, its tip fashioned into a series of barbs, and rubbed it to a polished hardness against a smooth stone. Then he made 3 more just like it, methodically, one after the next. The arrows alone took him over an hour, but even as he lay the last of them neatly next to each other, he knew he would have only one chance to win this battle. Perhaps only one shot. The sun disappeared behind the ridge of a dead volcano west of the Contamana border as Schaefer pounded a peeled root between 2 stones. He paused to draw saliva into the pulpy mass, scraping the milky substance onto a banana leaf. Mixing it with sticky sap from the banana tree, he held it over the coals till the concoction began to steam. Then he opened the last 2 cyanide capsules and tapped the powder into the bubbling liquid. He coated the arrow tips with the sticky poison, holding them over the coals so that the sap bubbled and smoked as he spun the arrow in his hands, blowing steadily on the tips to cool and harden the mixture. Using the blade of his machete, he pried open the casing of one of the 40mm grenades that had washed ashore in his sodden gun belt. Discarding the warhead, he dumped the dry propellant powder from the shell onto a leaf, mixing it with a mound of magnesium shavings. He opened the narrow, tight roll of gauze that had wrapped the cyanide capsules, fluffing it into a loose bundle the size of a golf ball, then poured the powder mixture over it, working it into the fabric. Dutch was absolutely clear-headed now, as he transferred the ball of explosive-laden gauze to a pliable dry leaf, closing it into a bundle and binding it at the top with a long strand of jungle grass. He twisted the remaining gauze around a match, leaving the head exposed, forming a self-striking fuse that he coated with sap. This too he thickly covered with powder from the grenade and poked the fuse into the leaf. Taking another blade of jungle grass, he made a large loop, tied it about the grenade, and slipped the loop over his head. Finally, using several sections of bamboo of different diameters, he fashioned a crude anti-personnel spear bomb. The sharpened tongue of his belt buckle served as a firing pin, and a 40mm shell from his belt pouch as the explosive charge. When he was done, 2 hours later, Schaefer was a totally new kind of commando, outfitted by the natural guts of his planet. He would find out now which world was tougher, his own or the aliens. But as he slung his new-fashioned weapons about him and stood on the brink of the dark river, he had a pang of poignant memory for Billy. Whatever it was the Sioux had believed in, Schaefer was its last repository now. He was the only priest the world had left, this soldier of fortune who believed in nothing at all. and the poor, defenseless planet was just going to have to make do with him.